Oh, great, thank you. So Lancaster is one of our Pathfinder cities, as we're calling them, working with a cluster of cities in the north. We're also Gary Mitchell, who's also here, is on our core oversight group, who helps steer the general direction of the Urban Agriculture Consortium. And it's really, really lovely to have been bringing some of this mapping work forward and together. So yeah, really excited to be like comparing notes at this stage, because there's so much need and interest in how we map food growing, land opportunities, and so on. Rachel.
Yeah, could you just share the link for the Zoom, because Jess hasn't got a link and she's struggling to get in, I think. If you, I could just send her Alice. Thank you. I'll just drop that to her now.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'll just pass to Nikki, and then Nikki, if you just want to pass on when you finish.
Yes, sure. So my name is Nikki. I work with Arup in landscape architecture team. And my role is landscape GIS analyst, so I do lots of mapping. And lately I work like in relation to mapping food spaces with Joanna, who is also working in my team. Would you like to continue?
Sure, thanks. My name is Joanna. I'm a landscape architect, and urban designer. I've transitioned a few times, but working in the urban realm or in spatial is really my fascination. And we've been working with Incredible Edible Lambeth to map potential food growing spaces. And I've always had a fascination with food. My parents are farmers, so I grew up eating and loving food, and obviously the concerns with industrial and modern agricultural practices is a huge concern for us, and its impacts on the environment and public health. So this is a fairly new sort of interest in sort of my career. I started looking at food and food mapping, and at the start of the pandemic, where we started, and that's how we met with Janie. But we'll talk a little bit more about our project once we get the chance. I'll pass on to Rachel. Thanks.
Hi everyone, yeah, it's nice to be here. Yeah, so as Maddie says, I'm based in Lancaster, and we're working with Urban Ag Consortium and Friends of the Earth and Mark Paxton Snow to do what started off actually as quite a small idea that we're discussing with our local food partnership about mapping where we could find food growing spots across the district for different reasons, for businesses and also for communities. But then we got, through Maddie, we got into discussions with Friends of the Earth about kind of their hotspots mapping approach and whether we could adapt that methodology for food growing spots. So now we're testing that with Mark and other partners across the Lancaster district, with the idea of creating a transferable open source methodology that others can use. Yeah, and I guess we can talk more about that as well. Yeah, I'll pass to Mark.
And I'll unmute. Hi everyone, my name is Mark Thurston. I'm a data scientist specialising in GIS and mapping. I'm currently, as Rachel said, I'm currently working with Rachel on a project up in Lancaster looking at identifying food locations for urban and peri-urban agriculture. Previously, I'd worked with Mary Stevens at FOE to develop a modelling framework to identify potential locations for tree growing in the Bristol and Bath Greenbelt. And what we're doing is taking that methodology and applying it to a food growing context. The only other thing I should say is that I'm also currently studying for a part-time PhD at Bristol University, where I'm looking at donut economics and the Southwest regional food economy. So it all kind of ties in. Perhaps I should pass to Mary. Sorry.
Thanks, Mark. My name is Mary Stevens. I'm from Friends of the Earth. I'm based in Bristol, but I have a national role in our innovation programme. And my job is really to come up with ideas at a small scale that we can prototype and test that are aligned with our mission and our vision. Try them out at a small scale and see whether they work, basically. So I originally started working with Mark a couple of years ago, testing out an idea that we kind of labelled hope spots, looking at mapping. That in particular was about mapping land for kind of regeneration and tree cover in the green belt. We were particularly around Bristol and Bath. But the methodology there was about bringing together kind of the places where there's the greatest social need with the places where there was the most nature potential. And we thought there was a lot of potential to apply that to food growing as well. And in fact, that's where it seemed to go. So it's really brilliant to see that kind of particular methodology being picked up in Lancaster. We're really excited to see that sort of prototype being developed further. In addition, there are a couple of other projects that I am involved with at Friends of the Earth that are relevant to this kind of conversation. In parallel with that, we also developed the work that I talked about. We also developed another form of kind of woodland opportunity mapping, which has now gone nationwide. Looking at making the land for tree cover, and that, of course, it obviously could include orchards and things like that, much more accessible to people. And that's now been integrated into a digital tool called Near You, where you can enter your postcode and you get loads of information about kind of climate indicators, but also about how your area is doing against nature and green space and so on. So that's quite exciting. I can share a link to that. I've been doing some work also looking at green space deprivation and land available in relation to disability in Bristol as well. So that's another little prototype that's quite interesting. And finally, one of our projects, another project that we've had running at Friends of the Earth for a little while that we're currently in the review stages of, is something called 10 times greener, where we were looking at developing the model of a postcode gardener. So how could you a kind of postcode gardener who's sort of a cross between a community organizer and a gardener, very much inspired kind of by the Incredible Edible model and things like that, but based on a subscription model as well, so that people were making a local contribution. We kind of tested that in Devon, in Hackney and East London, and in Chester, and we're just reviewing that. So I'm really interested in kind of how some of the tools that are being developed through this work might also support the development of that project. There was lots of things, sorry. And I'm going to pass on to Julian.
Hello, everyone. Wow, what an amazing bunch of people we've got on this call. I'm Julian, and I have done some work with Shared Assets, which is a think and do tank that focuses on common good land use with shared benefits. And in particular, the work I did with them was developing a mapping application called Land Explorer that uses Ordnance Survey APIs and then also bits of open government data. And Land Explorer is now incorporated into its own entity as a digital co-op. Also do a bunch of other things. So very involved in a network of climate emergency centres, which we've got a network of about 37 in cities around mostly urban spaces in cities around the UK now. It's meanwhile use of buildings that are scheduled for development currently is the model. And to give you an idea of that, for instance, we've got a 40,000 square foot warehouse in Ilford for the next year, possibly two. So really interested in the kind of things that we can grow in that kind of space. I'm also a founder of a project, a community benefit society in Norfolk called iFarm. And we're doing some research and development in terms of growing. I grew up on a small holding, so again very connected, sort of farming and food. The small holding I grew up on everything was horse drawn. But I'm particularly interested in a variety of different technologies where we can utilize space that might be affected by flooding, for instance. So floating beds and things called wallopinis, which are sunken greenhouses where you can grow citrus fruit year round. in temperatures of -20 and 8 foot of snow. And then also do some work with an organisation called Vocalize, which produces software to enable community action. So a whole bunch of things. Currently working with a friend at Friends of the Earth volunteer group in Suffolk as well, responding to Suffolk's climate action plan. And sort of as part of that, really very interested in mapping the farms themselves that we have, because we're a very rural area, the land projects that are springing up, because there's a real groundswell of people purchasing, ourselves included, 50, 10, 100, 80 acres all around the country, and networking and mapping those sort of projects. And has Gary, have you been yet? No, over to you.
Thanks, Julian, and morning all. Yeah, lots of experience here, and I'll try and give you a bit of a brief background as to why I'm here and interested in some of these conversations. But I'm Wales manager for Social Farms and Gardens, UK-wide charity. We're delivering some pretty extensive projects in Wales, primarily on behalf of Welsh Government. And over the years, over recent years, we've been trying to sort of get a real grasp of what's out there and where it is. And we've done some really, let's say, low-level mapping of the activity on the ground in terms of community food production. And we're at over 1,000 sites now across Wales that have been recorded on our very simple geo data map pin type system. And as Welsh Government are one of our key funders and NRW are one of our key partners, we really need to work out how we can transfer our existing data into GIS, really, so it's incorporated and compatible with their systems. The data we hold now is the biggest set of data for Wales for community food provision in a decade, and it's taken us a while to gather it, but it's not really fit for purpose, if you like. It's lovely to see who's where and what they're doing, so it maps the incredible edible movement, it maps the allotments, it maps the community orchards, it maps the community gardens, etc., etc. But it's a pretty basic set of spreadsheet incorporated data that relies on postcodes being pretty accurate to put them in the right location, and then a set of data behind those. So that's one of the reasons why I've muscled in on this conversation via Maddie. As Maddie said, I'm part of the Urban Agriculture Consortium core operating group, but actually I sit there representing Open Newtown. So that's a sort of I guess a can-do action think tank community group that are owning, managing land in Mid Wales's largest town and doing funky stuff with it. And a lot of that revolves around food and all sorts of other community development. In fact, I've got to leave this meeting bang on 1:30 to go and see a new £2 million building that we're putting up on our green spaces to talk about sustainability and things like that. So quite productive in what we're doing there. But specifically, obviously, I'm also involved in Food Policy Alliance Cymru. So we're looking at policy shift in Wales to more agroecological farming, and with that, urban agriculture opportunities as well. And that's a big part of my working remit, if you like, to look at where we can influence and shift policy. And in Wales, that's happening. I'm well aware of Land Explorer, but some of the data sets don't travel across to Wales yet, things like that. There is also a number of other mapping systems that are out there covering bits of Wales or all of Wales, some around networks specifically, some around local authority specific systems that they've set up themselves to get a flavour of what's going on where, and they're not really joined together, and they're certainly not in the same systems, as in they're not GIS enabled, all of them, etc., etc. So I guess it's for me to understand where we might share in some of the opportunities that you folk are developing, interested in, how we might gain some benefit. We're partnered up with Shared Assets on one of our funded projects already to talk about land in partnership with Land Workers Alliance as well. We've got a little bit of money to help map some of this stuff that we're doing. So it's mapping current existing activity, but also obviously more interested in a way of future activity and how we make sure that gets mapped and recorded as well. Thanks. I'll pass on to Alison, my colleague.
Hello. I'm just going to say it is actually the afternoon. I know this morning's gone very quickly, but it is definitely the afternoon. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm obviously Gary's colleague. I'm specifically working on a the project in Wales that we're working on with shared assets called Resilient Green Spaces, and that's where we're looking at kind of piloting quite a few alternative community-driven green space initiatives to look at in peri-urban and urban areas, to look at how communities can be the drivers for kind of alternative food systems around allotments, orchards, food hubs, farms and their ownership. So there's quite a few different bits and pieces there. It's all pilot stage, so it's all going to be quite small amounts of data, but I think what we're really keen on doing with that is making sure that the data that we collect is kind of mapped in a way that is useful for the future and can be built on, kind of in that pilot sense, I suppose, of making sure that we're not just collecting something that then goes on the back of a shelf somewhere, but that can be used as a methodology, as a lot of you have talked about, for kind of mapping things for the future. I am actually based just in Shropshire, so I do cover the UK with my role at Social Farms and Gardens, as well as this specific Wales project. So also kind of just thinking about how do we map other information that we hold at Social Farms and Gardens, and what could we be mapping, particularly something you talked about, kind of access to land for food growing. That's, you know, we get lots of inquiries about that, and making sure that everything's kind of future-proofed a little bit more. But I am also extremely new to mapping, so I love looking at the pretty like spatial pictures, but I really don't understand how it all goes together in the additional data behind that. So I'm really interested in finding out more and making sure that I am actually to grips with it. And I'm going to pass on to Jess.
Thank you, and sorry for coming in late. Rachel got the link to me, and it's great to join you all. So I'm a professor of sustainability at Lancaster University, and I'm the lead for a project called Urban Revolution, which looks at the health, sustainability and food system resilience benefits of increasing urban food growing. So Rachel came to me with this idea about urban hub spots and picking up on the Friends of the Earth work and working with lots of great partners. And I just thought it sounded like a fantastic opportunity, as, you know, we're really interested in, you know, where and how we can do urban agriculture in order to deliver multiple benefits. And I think that hub spots sort of idea captures that really nicely. So very excited to be working on this with you all. And another sort of related interest that might be relevant here, I think, because I think we talk about maps and land. So in another strand of my work, I do a lot of work on modelling soil carbon and nutrients and plants and land use change, and I've worked with DEFRA on trying to understand how some of their new policies might change things like carbon storage across the landscape. So yeah, we run UK scale models that look at soil change, so I'd be really interested whether there's any sort of join up in terms of understanding soils. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure who hasn't been still.
I think Rachel. Has Rachel spoken?
Yeah, I've already introduced myself.
Okay,
So,
I think we're done. Absolutely incredible, the amount of knowledge around this table today. I wish we were all meeting face to face. Thanks very much for sharing. I realised that there's just so much crossover between what we're all doing, and I think this is what Maddie and I understood and recognised when we started talking a few months ago. And how can we collaborate for to escalate this, to make it go, to speed up the process, to enable communities access to land. And I think today I'd like to see how we don't waste time in kind of reinventing the wheel, because so many of us have been looking at this mapping land. How can we share knowledge better? That's really why I think we felt it would be imperative that we all start talking to each other. So what we're going to do now is, I mean, there's so many projects and I'm not quite sure how to do this. Maddie's going to let each project, introduce each project to have literally 8 minutes, because those intros took 20 minutes and I don't want to take too much of all of your time. But I think whilst people are talking, think about how we can share knowledge better. The idea now is that Joe is going to present with Nikki and myself the ARUP IEL project. I'm saying 8 minutes, and then from there we will, Maddie will take over with introducing other groups. So if Maddie, if you do some private chat, letting people know who's going to go next, or you put it in the chat, is that okay? So Joe, I've made you co-host if you want to share your screen.
Sorry, I was on mute. So many different virtual chats. Kind of forget you're on which one you're on. Okay, so we'll get started on our food mapping project. So our food mapping project stemmed from the first lockdown. I'm part of, I founded an organization called Humanitarian Landscape Collective, and during the first pandemic, the first wave, we started linking up to mutual aid calls and just listening in and offering our sort of landscape professional skills in any which way people needed. And from there, it sort of catapulted into conversations with Incredible Edible and other food charities about how dire the food system was, and how many people were actually facing hunger on a daily basis, even pre-pandemic, which was really shocking for me as someone who grew up in Africa and really experienced poverty. And this is, one of the richest countries in the world. So very shocking. And I thought I needed to know more about this. Met Janie. Ooh, let's go next. So we'll just quickly run through our project introduction and overview, the methodologies and methods that we used for the analysis, our GIS capturing and crowdsourcing, and then a little bit more on the multi-criteria analysis process and results that stem from that project, and the next steps for our project now that it's coming to a close. So our project aims were to identify all the potential and existing food growing spaces in Lambeth. I'm a local resident, so I've obviously got a vested interest as well. We wanted to develop a comprehensive food growing map. There was obviously nothing really showing us. We knew where the existing allotments were, but in terms of community food growing, we know there's a massive waiting list, and people who really need to access food growing or are experiencing hunger don't really necessarily have their own gardens or spaces to grow food. So there was definitely a gap in trying to unlock more urban land for food growing, as well as other benefits as like access to green space and for mental health and ecological benefits. And the aim for our project was always to make it scalable and replicable as well, because Incredible Edible has over 150 groups nationwide. So apart from Incredible Edible, this could be adopted by other organizations working in a more spatial sort of neighborhood scale. So the key impacts and outcomes for the project was to strengthen the local food activities that already exist, increase local food resilience and production, and then elevate the importance of food growing in urban spaces. And Nikki and Janie, please interject if you want to add anything. I'm just whizzing through because I know we're on a time limit. And of course, the ultimate would be also to influence local climate action strategies in the council, and we've had a few conversations, and we linked with a few people in council, which is really positive. It's really exciting that they're really supportive of this work, and we keep touching base with their strategies and their future plans in terms of climate resilience and the food and poverty conversation. So the methodologies and methods that we used, and bear in mind, when we applied for funding, We thought COVID was sort of coming to an end, and the lockdown, and then we had a third lockdown. So that really affected some of our key tasks that we had kind of set out for the project. So we had to quickly pivot and change our approach. So the first one that we used was Gis Mapping and Analysis, and that's where Nikki comes in with her expertise. So this was largely in-house Arup sort of run. We did this desktop research to collate, analyze, and visualize freely available open source data sets, which the UK is amazing with, I must say. And that was obviously linked to creating an open source methodology, which is very similar to, sorry, I think it was Mary who mentioned it. Was it Mary? Someone mentioned it. Sorry, I might have got that wrong. And then the second collection method that we used was crowdsourcing geospatial data from local residents, businesses, charities in the area to identify and record potential food growing spaces on an online map. And again, Nikki was very instrumental in developing that tool. So this is just like a quick little, oh, how are we doing with time? I think we're okay. Sorry if I'm going too fast. Hopefully you're catching all of this, but it's recorded as well. So the online interactive map is as you can see, it can work in any device, and it was great because it was, if you had a mobile phone, it's obviously location independent. So as you're walking and strolling around your neighborhood, you could map as you go along. And we had loads of limitations in this sense because we tried to find existing mapping tools but there were limitations in terms of people needing to create accounts, and we just knew we were going to lose people. So we created something that was embedded in IEL's website. So their members had, they had trust and faith in this, and it was completely anonymous as well. And some of the key details that we asked, we didn't want it to be this lengthy survey. Again, we would lose people. So we asked some key information that describes the characteristics of the space. And then of course, like a point to locate the space. The second one was a combination of two citizen mapping initiatives. The one was online interactive map, which I just described, and the other one was the analog alternative, because we knew a lot of people in Lambeth and throughout the UK still experience digital exclusion, or there's some kind of limitations to accessing things online. So we linked up with a food charity and created these sort of packages to map and post the results back to us, and with various degrees of success, of course, because social distancing and yeah, a story for another time, with lots of lessons learned. And then on the far right, you could see the spatial typologies that we linked into the mapping. So you can see things like car parks that may be underused, for instance, or housing estates that have open space that's really underperforming or really barren or could do a lot more. Maybe there's certain places in parks, allotments. So we wanted to, so allotments are there because we wanted to map the existing, just in case that data isn't online and available. So these were both for existing and potential. So we'll move on to the multi-criteria analysis, which is more Nikki's domain. So maybe you want to talk about this, Nikki?
Yes, sure. So what
Thanks.
we did was like to gather open source data in order to be able to easily repeat the process in other situations. So what we did was like, first of all, we split our data into need analysis of need and feasibility. In the need, we mainly used the LSOAs, the data per LSOA. So we had data, for example, about unemployment in an area or like education levels, in order to understand which areas are mostly in need for creation of these food growing spaces. And then in the feasibility, we use data about, for example, land uses. We excluded, for example, the roads and land belonging to railways. And we included pollution. So we wanted to exclude areas of like high pollution around main roads. etc. Then what we did was to overlay this data and to come up with the areas that were mostly were preferred to grow food, because they were mostly neat and it was also feasible to create the spaces there. In the end, we overlaid the points that we gathered, the locations. Here you can see like the table with all our data analytically. And in the end, what we did was to overlay the points that we gathered from the crowdsourced mapping into our preferred locations, and in this way to highlight these points as the really existing and feasible preferred locations.
And then the final combined results. So on the left-hand side, we have all the green, which shows feasible sites, which are either owned by council or a really big landowner. So it would make negotiations a lot easier to unlock those pieces of land, as well as other sort of indicators that and factors that Nikki just mentioned. And then on the right-hand side, it's an overlay of all the crowdsourcing mapping and the different typologies that we managed to acquire. So this is a little bit out of date. There's a few more points that have come in. And then so that's kind of where we are. We've now identified these really feasible spaces, and we just managed to not get awarded, we are shortlisted for a competition. So we can actually take this to the next stage, to phase 2, to develop a framework to empower urban communities to turn underutilized urban spaces into local food growing. And there's a lot to learn from Incredible Edibles Grow Back Greener Fund and their work that they've been doing with 6 estates, 6 housing estates in Lambeth to various degrees of success. But ultimately, we would like to create like a framework that can be adopted for communities to self-organize and to really make a success of community food growing. And then stage 3 would be to pilot a variety of typologies for food growing, from rooftops to car parks so that will be more of like an architectural scale, and maybe we can create some kind of a toolkit that really helps people adopt this and understand, the financial liability or constraints of creating a community food growing program, and the sort of negotiation between, or the governance of such spaces, and the complexities and the conflicts. And that's about it for me. Janie, is there anything else you want to add?
No, it's fantastic. That was great overview, and I think Maddie's suggesting that are there any questions at this stage, or shall we hear about? Do you want to just stop sharing your screen, Joe, and sure. Then over to you, Maddie.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought, well, it's fresh in everyone's minds. It might be a few clarifying questions or key questions. We'll kind of just for a few minutes. I know I've got some. We'll have that at the end of each sort of presentation, and then we'll have a discussion after. Is everyone able to stay till 1:30? Just checking.
Let me just check. Yes, fine with me.
Okay, great. Thanks all. Brilliant. So has anyone got a question for Joanna, Nikki? Rachel?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. That was a really amazing project and a great overview. And it does sound very similar to what we were planning to do in the urban areas in particular. So yeah, and thank you, Maddie, for making a connection and stopping replication of effort, which is perfect. I guess I'd be interested to know, like, with the GIS bit and the open source data sets, and how, like, it'd be very interesting to go into a bit more detail with you about your methodology and whether, how we could collaborate to kind of extend it, or what you would like to change or improve if you could. And I wondered if that's like, is it something you're planning to publish, and is it going to be open source so other people can use it and adapt it as well?
Yeah. Go ahead, Nikki.
Hello? Yeah. So yes, we're already like creating like a story map, which will be also freely available for people to share with, so that everyone knows like exactly what data we used, how we located it, and how we analyzed it. So our analysis in this stage, it was like pretty basic. As I said, so we used like initially some kind of zoning. So we had lots of data per LSI, which is the lowest output like in London. And then after we highlighted these areas, what we did was to just overlay it and highlight like smaller areas within these LSOAs based on the rest of the layers that we had available. So it was just an overlay analysis. But what I was initially planning to do was like a weighted analysis, like to give extra weight to specific factors and like decide which factors matter the most for us. But we didn't have like time to do this at this stage. Maybe we'll do it like going forward.
Yeah, it looks fantastic, and I really love the app you created for, because this is something we've been talking about with our food partnership, is how can we get people to kind of feed in like what they might want to see in different places, and have that system engagement with it.
So
we had to do we had a demo session as well, just in case, because we're obviously not software developers. So it was a lot of trial and error, and we did a user feedback session. So we've learned a lot in sort of like the digital space, and how to really take, you know, the work that we do on the ground, take it virtually. So I would love to link up with you and learn as much as we can, and share as much information as possible. But yeah, the story map is obviously a place where we're going to archive everything that we've done and the results. And it will probably be sort of a repository for other boroughs in London or across the UK to also start getting their own profiles in the space.
Also, we were keen not to have a separate app, weren't we? So we embedded it within the Incredible Edible Lambeth website, so people didn't need to download an app.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't want to take people away to another website and then have to, you know, get a profile and sign in and all that. Yeah.
Is it, sorry, I have another question. Is it something you're considering sharing with the rest of the Incredible Edible network?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. That's why we've done it. We want but not just Incredible Edible. I mean, this is why we're here, right? To share.
Yeah.
Maddie, did you have anything, or should we move on? I'm conscious we've taken quite a big chunk of this time.
I think that's right. I did have a question about it refers to community food growing, which is of a particular scale and type when you think about that compared to like small commercial opportunities. So I was wondering whether you also foresaw this opening up opportunities for small scale enterprise, land-based enterprises as well, and how that might be enabled.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the mapping can definitely aid in that further down the line. So our first stage was just research based, and now we have to really take it to the next level and start engaging with communities. So we found what was really interesting about the people who were engaging with the mapping and the places that we found that had the greatest need for food growing didn't correlate. So there's going to be a lot of community engagement that we're going to have to do in the next stage. And of course, like social enterprises in food growing is definitely a viability for unlocking that land. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, and do just have in your minds, obviously this is just the beginning of beautiful relationships that will blossom, and think about how you can offer what you have to each other, what you might need from each other, and how we'll talk at the end about how we take this forward and what you feel the next steps might be that would serve you best. Alison.
Sorry, just a quick question. What was the driver behind this? Sorry if I've missed something. Was it an Incredible Edible initiative, or was it ARUP, or what was kind of the driving force? What's your aim with this?
I think it was a combination of both, Janie. I think we just aligned. We were like, we need to make, you know, a really tangible difference in food growing. something sustainable, not because, you know, food banks are just popping up everywhere, 800% demand over the last year in some places. So it just wasn't, it was just a symptom of a system that was failing. And when I met Jenny on a call, we just have the same, she has a mapping background as well. I'm really interested in that as well as a you know, urban designer and landscape architect. So, but Jenny, maybe there's,
I think the big thing in Lambeth is that we have all these housing estates with this basically derelict land that's just been mown to death and pruned to death, and a complete disassociation of the residents and the land. And how do we reconnect those communities with their immediate land around them? We've got lovely parks, they're all winning awards and everything, and they've got wildlife areas and food growing, but immediately around, sorry about the music in the background, immediately around their neighbourhoods, they were not engaging with the land. And so this was a good way of identifying those pieces of land, and also linked very well with this project that we've been undertaking, which has been across 6 housing estates with the Mayor of London money, Grow Back Greener money. So just, there's so much difficulty in that community engagement stage. And that's what we've really learned from this last 7-month project with these housing estates. And we knew it, and we undertook this project because we knew how difficult it was to engage communities. And we created this template of engagement for people to get more involved, you know, that signposting them, who are the key people they need to talk with. So this is all a kind of rights to grow thing that we're working on across the whole of Incredible Edible, which I know will resonate with a lot of you here, is how do communities realise or have their eyes opened to the fact that there is land and they could grow food on it, but they need a whole lot of stuff unlocking. And the mapping is just one part of how you unlock this land for communities to grow food on. So that's a kind of broader picture stuff.
Jess, did you have a...
Yeah, really quick. And just, yeah, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I think there's so many parallels, and it just speaks to me that it's a good idea and it's timely, right? That's why it's happening. I just, you know, thinking about what you said, Maddie, about partnership and where we go from here. And I would like, you know, for us to think about as well, not only the need for people, but the need for ecosystems as well. I think that, you know, I'd like to put that out as a challenge for us to think about, and to think about where this is good for the ecosystem as well, and what can we do about that. So
yes, absolutely. That was one of our mapping data sets as well, as biodiversity in places that are lacking biodiversity in the neighborhood or in the borough. So those are also places of immediate concern, and we can have a food growing space that is also biologically, sorry, losing my words, but yeah, biodiverse, that's what I mean.
It's great. It's done then. It's good.
Thank you. Julian.
Yeah, great work. Interested in a couple of things. I wonder what map base you used for it. And I'm also curious where the funding for the project came from.
So in terms of map base, we used the Esri software in general. So yeah, it was a custom made base map, but coming from, like, created in Esri platform.
And as for the funding, it was funded internally by our company. We have a funding area called Invest in Arup, and they invest in staff ideas. So this was like my own personal sort of ambition and project, and I put an application together and they funded it. So, and that sort of set the wheels in motion. And then we got additional funding now for phase 2 through a separate stream, but still the same company. Yeah, so we're going from strength to strength.
Cool.
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Amazing. Thanks. Let's move on to Mark and Rachel and Mary to talk about what's happening in Lancaster District with the food land hope spots mapping. Over to you.
Yeah, do you want me to go first, Mark? Maybe to give a bit of the background of where this has come from. So, sorry, I haven't got a presentation. Got a lot of things on, and this is one of them. And yeah, so this project really came about because in Lancaster and Morecambe, we're developing a local food strategy where we've kind of, like you said, Jane, we've mapped out kind of what is needed to totally transform how we're interacting with food locally, what's available for local people, our local food economy as well. So it brings in kind of the local food businesses and also our kind of our rural areas around us, because we're quite a rural, very different from Lambeth, we're quite a rural, smallish city, a coastal city, and we're also very much a livestock dominated area, and we want to increase massively the amount of small scale market gardens around our peri-urban area and into the rural. So that's a big focus of the food partnership, and then a big focus that's kind of this project as well, that maybe differentiates it slightly from, or adds something slightly different to what you've done. And one of the things that we needed from the food partnership was really a land audit of what land is available across the district for food growing. And we wanted to look at community food projects, but also these food businesses, right through to the stage of how do you even identify what land might be suitable, and then kind of looking at how do you maximize it, like its suitability in terms of what's suitable for communities and what's more suitable for businesses. So taking an approach of what do businesses need and what do communities need, and are they different, and what data sets can help inform that, right through to the stage of what I need to deliver for the food partnership, which is actually a land audit, almost like a list of bits and parcels of the land and landowners and legal kind of restraints and access issues as well. So through to some big kind of scale pictures of the district, through to some actual real details on some sites that we could approach to support we have a farm start scheme, like a lot of people going through a farm start scheme that then will want to look hopefully for their own land or rented land for market gardens. So it's all kind of interlinked. So there's a big data kind of mapping element, but there's also a very practical, like actually can we get names, addresses, contact numbers and stuff out at the end of it. So similarly, we applied for some internal funding from Lancaster University to work with Mark and develop what him and Mary had been working on with Friends of the Earth, which is in some ways it's a very similar methodology to what you've discussed with the GIS layers, and maybe I can let Mark talk more about that because you did that piece of work. But we're looking at kind of what open data sets are available, and like what questions do we need to be asking. So we had obviously some of the similar things as you've mentioned, but we've also looking into the rural areas, like what data do we actually need to better identify land parcels out there. We're looking at contamination, but also how we could look at soil quality. There's a lot of discussion, like there's a lot of kind of, people say locally it's very easily, it's only easy to grow sheep and cows around here. It's a very quick dismissal of the idea that we can even grow fruit and vegetables and other things on our land. So we wanted to kind of say, like, what data sets can we use to demonstrate what could be possible locally. Yeah, and then the idea of that would be to do the same kind of layered mapping of land suitability and requirements, and kind of what's suitable for communities and what's suitable for businesses, and then identify a number of sites which we then take forward to, like, actually how do we access those bits of land, what are the legal constraints, and kind of similar to you, like curating a storyboard of that process so that other places can understand, like, how do you start from we need to know who owns land, or how do we access land locally, through to actually being able to have some numbers and contact details of people. Yes, and then we also want to, like, use it as an opportunity to engage the local community with the whole process, with the idea of how land could be used differently in the urban space in particular. So we're designing, as part of a festival that we're having locally in the run up to COP, we're designing an interactive food trail around the city that will kind of link to a number of the spots we've identified in the urban area, and kind of give some kind of visualizations of what that could look like and get interaction from people as they go around that trail, either guided or unguided. So yeah, there's a few different elements, and there's definitely like lots and lots of overlap. And Mark, do you want to talk more about any particulars? And we're quite near the start of the project as well.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to Joanna and Nikki for that presentation. Before I kind of explain the approach we're taking, which is very similar to the one you outlined, I thought I'd address something that Gary asked when he was asking whether anyone knew about geofutures, because I also think this has got some important context with how the project in Lancaster will evolve. So I ran a geospatial data science consultancy called Geofutures for about 20 years, which sadly I had to close last year, or the end of last year. And throughout our time at Geofutures, we've done quite a lot of work on food mapping. So in fact, we worked with Incredible Edible Somerset and Somerset Community Food, creating an online mapping system. This was back in 2007, 2008. Did some work with the Transition Network, looking at modelling what we called food sheds, so trying to identify how much land settlements needed to turn over to food production to be completely self-sufficient, and so on and so on and so on. And it was sadly, I think that we were a little bit ahead of our time, and there wasn't that traction. But of course, because of that, and talking with Mary, it became quite clear that some of the work we'd done would have real application in looking at, in the first instance, identifying locations for tree planting in the Bristol and Bath Greenbelt. Now, right from the start, something that Mary and I agreed on was that this methodology should be open source, because it's really, really important. And that is what we're kind of effectively doing with the Rurban project, is taking all that knowledge and experience and reapplying it in the context of the Rurban project in Lancaster district. And there's a lot of crossover with the methodology. Now, the reason I kicked off this with the context of Geofutures is that we are sitting, well, Geofutures did have quite a bit of data, and some of it was collected in an open source way. And one of the things I am currently doing, as I kind of go through the final stages of winding the business up, is I'm going to make as much of that available as I possibly can on our Git repo. So we'll be publishing our Git repo with code and also with data where we can release it. And I see that the work we did with Mary, and then with Rachel and Jess, in turn will be made available via that Git repo. So it's a way of actually opening everything up, not only for people to use, but also for people to modify, because obviously the key thing here is that we evolve based on what we have. So to your question, Gary, yeah, probably I can track down some of that allotments data, and if we catch up offline, I'll see, I'll do some digging into the archives and see what we've got. But in that context of wanting to not lose absolutely everything that Geofutures did, particularly in this domain, we're also very keen, and something Rachel and I have talked at length about making sure it is as widely available and as widely applicable to community groups around the country. So part of that has been looking at the technology platforms we're using. And while all us GISers are familiar with Esri, most of us having trained on it, of course, there is a cost for using that, even for community groups, even through the Esri's kind of sponsored kind of charitable aspect. So instead, what we're looking to do is to use Qgis, which is basically the open source GIS that's very, very powerful. And in fact, which was the GIS that we predominantly used on Mary's project, and start to look about wrapping up code and information around Qgis, so that community groups or indeed small businesses who wouldn't be able to afford a proper GIS package will be able to generate the intelligence and the insights that the modelling approach can offer them. So, as Rachel said, the model that we're developing in Rurban, based on the FOE Friends of the Earth Hope Spots project, is not just for community growing, but is also looking to support small businesses and to help support kind of reinvigoration of market gardening potentially in that part of the world. We're starting off in a similar way to identify what we call candidate locations. So those plots of land that are most suited for food growing, not just within the city, but also on the periphery, perhaps looking at some plots of agricultural land, which might be applicable for switching from, say, pastoral to arable or market garden use. What we're looking to do is to use as much open source data as we can as a kind of basic framework. So, for example, the Ordnance Survey green space data, but then also to augment that where appropriate with data we can get from local authorities. And certainly that's something that we've been really lucky with on the Rurban project, is that we're working quite closely with Lancaster City Council to that end. So what we have to be aware of, I think, and it's something to bear in mind in all these sorts of projects, is just access to data, and whether community groups can get access to all the data they want, and whether we can collect data successfully from the communities. Certainly the work we did with Somerset Community Food and Incredible Edibles Somerset, what that demonstrated over a long period of time, that project went for about 5 years, was that while there was an initial surge of interest, it quickly dropped off, and the data itself started to get out of date, basically, and there wasn't kind of a sufficient energy or interest in the wider community to keep that data set going. And that's something I think for all these projects is to bear in mind. And one reason certainly is our start point. I think it's important for us to access data that is maintained, whether that's by the Ordnance Survey, arguably organisations like OpenStreetMap, or indeed by the local authorities themselves. But at the heart, however it's collected, whether it's from published sources, local authorities, from community collected processes, we'll come up with a list of locations that are suitable for food growing, at least on the face of it, because then there's a next stage of actually starting to grade those locations on their suitability. Perhaps, I mean, something that Rachel's very interested in and just very interested in is in terms of soil quality. We've got a real problem with that, of course, because soils data is tied up with the British Geological Survey and costs an awful lot of money, and that's a bit of an issue that I think we're all going to face. And if we could address, I mean, Janie, I know I saw pop up on the chat something about one of Incredible Edibles projects to kind of change the policy context. I think access to data, particularly soils data, which has been collected nationally with taxpayers' money ultimately, is not being made available for community groups, and I think that's a bit of a I think that's a bit poor, frankly. So if we look at soils, we look at particularly in the context of not so much urban areas, but kind of smaller towns and the urban periphery, moving into the countryside. We want to look at things like biodiversity, SSSIs, all these things that would actually preclude the use of a site for food production. Then we got the social dimension, and this was something that FOE were very interested in, really drove in the project. And again, we looked at combining a large number of different data sets, not so much the IMD, partly because that was at LSOA level, and we felt that in some instances that we lost resolution, because of course a lot of these plots are quite small. and what we do need to do wherever possible is to identify neighbourhoods and smaller communities. So there's a variety of different ways that we can look at that, notwithstanding the fact that some, we do continue to use LSOA data. And rather than doing a polygonal overlay, sorry, this might get a bit techie now, but this I think might be useful for Joanna and Nikki. Rather than using a polygonal overlay, because we were using data from so many different spatial scales, we converted them into a 50-meter raster and used a basic overlay in that sense. Just another technical aside, something which I would like to explore with you in more detail was you mentioned the possibility of weighting input data sets. A lot of my work in the last couple of decades, to be fair, has been with overlay analysis. And one of the things that is quite interesting is that adding weights to overlay maps doesn't actually influence the outputs as much as your decision for what variables to put in at the beginning. And certainly when you're starting to play with raster data, you find that you've got to put extreme weights to alter the outputs. So that's that. So I'm looking directly at Nikki and Joanna here. Love to pick up with you on that and talk in a bit more detail.
Yeah, incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. I've got a whole book full of notes already.
so I'll move away from uber techie stuff now. Just quickly wrap up by saying, again, the crucial thing is looking at supply and demand. And what part of that demand, the supply side is obviously the land parcels, the supply side, the demand side are community groups or communities who may want to get involved in community growing. And then we've also got the businesses who are interested. And obviously the requirements of a business or a small startup, and crucially their bank manager, is going to be very different to that of a community group. And that's a really important part of the Urban project, which really takes the kind of Hope Spots methodology that one step further. So I'll stop just about there, just to kind of reiterate that we want this project to be open source. We want this to be available to any group who want to get involved with it, whether that's someone just looking as a startup, whether that's a small community group, and to actually develop something that doesn't require license fees, whether that's for software and data. And also on the back of the stuff that GeoFutures worked on to make that the code and the model know-how available to as many people as possible, not only to use, but also to evolve. I think that's me.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Sorry, we lost Mary at 1 o'clock, but that was great, Rachel, Mark. I'm just conscious that it's 8 minutes past 1, so we've got 20 minutes, and I want us to be able to have a full round of thoughts on what the next steps should be. But I'd also like to, just conscious that Julian has a lot of expertise and insight that he might like to share, and we'll also obviously need to continue this conversation, and so we'll, at the end of this, we'll look at how we do that as well. But I just wanted to make sure that we brought Julian in with any sort of thoughts, reactions, responses, questions, insights that you might have at this stage, Julian.
Where's he going?
I don't know, and you're on mute. I'm not sure. Are you?
He's on the run.
Yeah. Get me out of here. Hey.
Yeah.
Are you there? You've frozen.
Wi-Fi's breaking up, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Just in the pause, does anyone else have any Any questions for Rachel and Mark?
I thought what you said about soil was so relevant, Mark. We've come up against that, the cost of soil analysis, and the cost of soil analysis going on for me. And I'd like to pick up on that later and how that might feed into this Rights to Grow bill that we are developing. I'd really like to share that draft with everybody at some stage, because I think it will be absolutely relevant to all of us. We're looking to present that probably as an amendment to a planning bill. We've got someone from Town and Country Plan, TCPA it is, isn't it? Is that what it's called? Working on it. We've had a legal team looking at it. I really think that's going to be something that all of us could engage with. But I want to add access to soil data. I want to put that in there somewhere. So I'll follow up with you, Mark.
Yeah, and perhaps something we're thinking about in another project in Lancaster is soil guidance in construction and development, and this is completely related in the right to good soil when housing is developed and
absolutely
communities are developed. So yeah, we'd love to have a PhD student working on that at the moment. We'd love to connect into that if that would be interesting.
One of the things on that point, we were thinking of mapping community composting bins and kitchen waste collection points. And because I'm now on this food project, my eyes are just peeled, and I'm starting to spot them dotted around in the neighborhood. And I just think this would be an amazing resource to just bring that to the foreground, especially if we're going to be initiating more food growing projects in urban areas where soil degradation is terrible. How do we instill that health back into the soils and create better food for our communities? And Mark, thanks so much for sharing that wealth of knowledge. Definitely lots of crossover, especially in the next stages of our project. The legal side of unlocking land, how that's going to happen, I don't know. But yeah, we'll stay in touch and we'll share notes.
I think that's where Julian comes in, because there's a lot about meanwhile space with land, and the rights to grow is not like a right to ownership, but a meanwhile right for communities to grow lands. And you touched on that earlier, Julian. Are you able to speak now? Or still not? Oh, he's struggling, isn't he, with his...
Yeah.
Where's he gone? Oh, Gary's here.
Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that particular point. A bit of work we're doing specifically in Wales at the moment is working directly with local authorities to do their own land mapping and to get them to almost traffic light what they've got. So we know it takes years to extract land out of local authorities or Welsh government and put them into community ownership. And one of the biggest barriers is we spend ages finding out which department owns the land. Then we go through that fairly hideous process. Then somebody has to decide whether it's surplus to their requirements, which is a pretty awful term. And often that journey might take us 18 months, 2 years. And at the end of it, we get to the point where they say, no, it's not surplus to requirements. So what we're trying to do is work with some specific local authorities to do that land mapping ahead of those inquiries coming in, so that they effectively traffic light their land. So if it's red, don't bother coming to us, stay away. You're not going to get it for years. We've got development needs on it. We've got protected mineral rights, whatever it might be. And then at the other end of the scale, show us the stuff that's green, the stuff that really is surplus to your requirements and effectively a liability for you, and we'll do the match dating, if you like, the dating service between the community groups and your loans. And then there might be a chunk of land that's amber somewhere in the middle, particularly around farmland. A lot of our farmland in Wales is still owned by local authorities under their farm holdings, and we'd love to get our hands on some or any of it or more of it, but we know that's definitely in that sort of amber list, and that's part of our specific project to look at the barriers as to why local authorities won't consider community groups as applicable to farm tenancies, and with an end goal of literally extracting some out of ownership and putting them into community use. If we can speed up a couple of local authorities to do that, we think we've got a real opportunity to showcase that to others, because that's definitely one of our biggest barriers. The barrier isn't necessarily local authorities wanting to give up land, or Welsh Government to a degree, and the barrier certainly isn't community groups wanting land, but often there's a real mismatch. So community groups come to us, I found a piece of land, can you help me get it? So we run the Community Land Advisory Service in Wales, and we deal with, I don't know, 100 inquiries a year, if not more, around groups wanting to find land, but also we work with the landowners to say, right, what have you got? We'll try and find you a community group. But the mismatch is so often there. We have land in some areas and we have no community groups, and in other places we have loads of community groups and no land. So we're just trying to speed up that process, and that's potentially one way of doing it.
Gary, have you got an example of a local authority that's on board with mapping their own spaces?
Carmarthenshire are just beginning the process. They're putting some funded officer time into it. Monmouthshire is ahead of the game, so they've done most of it. And then depending on how you look and how they class their farming estates, most of the local authorities have a pretty good map and an idea of where their farming estates are, but actually the problem is saying that communities should have access to it. But yeah, Carmarthen, we're nudging Carmarthen very proactively, and they're really on board to do that. It will take them a while, we know that, but Monmouthshire are probably further ahead than most. But depending on which areas you looked at, so some of our local authorities actually do know where their allotments are, others haven't got a clue. So it depends what types of land, and one of the issues with local authorities, some of our local authorities don't have a single land department. Every department owns and manages their own pieces of land, so therefore they then don't have these central systems really that work, or if they do, it just says it's not my department, it's somebody else's. So yeah, it can be a real mess. And then obviously in Wales as a tool, and I assume you've got it in England, but I definitely, my sphere is Wales. We use the community asset transfer guidance, legislation and policies to try and make that happen in some shape or form. And in other areas, actually, another good one that's about to jump into the sphere is Cardiff City Council. They're now a silver sustainable food places city. We're slightly frustrated, but they're picking on 3 of their wards within the city to do that detailed mapping and to show what's available. Where we're struggling with them a bit is, if you only focus on that, the rest of the city doesn't get a look in, and it's going to take you a year to do that piece. But they're currently digging their heels in and saying, we need to pilot it. We're going to do it in these 3 wards. Let us do that first and then come back to us for more. So there's a couple of active ones, which is positive. But what'll come out of it, the other end of my fear with Cardiff, for instance, is either they get over inundated with requests once they've done the mapping and they just can't manage it, or more worrying is they don't get any community interest from that process, and then it doesn't help us find more where we've already got interest. So anyway, but yeah, there's some good examples.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I think Lambeth Council would be open to that. We have a link with the local council who's been very open with how they do their data analysis, and he's a bit of a data scientist but engineer as well. So maybe he's our way into kind of getting the council to adopt, a more centralized system, as you say. Sorry for interjecting, Rachel.
Oh no, it's good. Well, basically my point follows on from you really, is that the one thing that this project's highlighted just from our interactions so far with our city council is they have actually a lot of data. They've done a lot of green space mapping on different levels, and they've done community engagement and kind of getting community feed-in on green spaces that exist. So their data sets are really good, and they've actually been really open to working with us. And it's kind of one of the things we want to highlight through the project. So I think, yeah, they would probably be very interested in this idea of mapping their assets. I think they've already mentioned that's something they want to get a handle of. And also the compost bin idea. We're speaking to our planners, and they're actually putting in place composting guidance in the local plan related to the climate emergency they announced. And I think they would be very interested to talk to other people that might be trying to do similar things in their councils, because they have been asking for evidence and kind of what do they need to include in the local plan around compost spaces. And so that's really positive. And then the question I had, I guess, to this group is a thing that I'm really concerned about is the urban land feels like there's not very much urban land actually. I don't think there's lots of little spaces, but I'm wondering, for my interest in the big spaces, the peri-urban, and I've looked on the land ownership, like Who Owns England, and it's so little data of who owns that space. The land registry, you have to pay for access, and I don't even know if much will be on there anyway. And I'm wondering whether anyone in this group has experience of how do you access that kind of land and make contact and find out who would be willing to give up an acre, because that's really what we're actually after as a food partnership with the business side of things. I see it being a massive challenge.
Thank you.
Any ideas or over time that people have would be great.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. I think that's a question for our next meeting, to definitely explore. There's quite a lot of things. I think it'd be really good to co-create the agenda, the next agenda, you to say what it is that you want to talk about, what do you want to foreground with each conversation. And I'm sorry, Julian, that you got overheated in the conservatory, and I'm really conscious that we've got 10 minutes left, and I'd like to just have a closing round, but I'd really love to get more of your input next time, and to hear a bit more from Wales as well. Well, all of you on a lot of the things that have come up. So does that sound okay if we have a closing round in the last 10 minutes? I'd sort of like you to share how you're leaving this meeting. Any thoughts about when you would like to reconvene, and how we might connect up the projects in a practical sense, like communicate sort of from going forward, whether that's like an email thing or a Slack thing, or is there a way that would be most helpful for you, and any kind of next steps, but just real headliney things. And I'll share a document for with the sort of thoughts from today, and something where we can co-create the next agenda. So if I could just start with maybe you, Nikki, and then you just pass it on from there. So how are you leaving this meeting, and something about next steps and how we stay connected?
Yes, I definitely found it very interesting and inspiring. It's really nice to know that we're working on the same kind of things, all of us. And I would really like, especially to focus maybe, I don't know, maybe even a smaller group, like more technical aspects, because it didn't go at all into really detail of what and how we analyze our data and all this technical stuff. And I found very interesting also the comment about the software, that it is really a problem there, because we have our company, of course it covers everything, but if a smaller local group wants to replicate the process, they would have issues. But in any case, they would, if they didn't use this, they would need a programmer. So it's again kind of an issue. And I would be very happy to meet you again in the future. Thank you. I don't know. So Jana, would you like to go next?
No. So yeah, thank you so much for roping us into this really informative meeting, Janie, and bringing us all together. Definitely, this is the beginnings of sort of my digital mapping interests. So I'm really happy to keep touching base with everyone. And also sharing notes. We've obviously wanted to create an open source and accessible methodology in our first round, but again, we faced so many issues with Esri being our point of call, and of course that's kind of failed on its head. So although we'll be documenting everything and giving recommendations, like the conversations that we had here today definitely will inform, our closing sort of steps in our project, to inform the next stage. And I'm really interested on how to get action on the ground. Super aware of the mapping being a critical sort of unlocking of opportunities, but the next step is to really have successful spaces that are healthy and working, and also and in terms of meeting up again, I'm super busy, and then I'm going to be on holiday for the next month. So not the next month, till the end of the month. So, and then we have our global challenge kicking off as well, which is going to be discussing the phase 2 of our project. And we just need to reconvene with extra partners that are joining us in the project. So maybe in a month's time, we would have a little bit more to share, questions to ask you as an audience as well, because we're fairly new at this. And was there other questions that we needed to answer? I think that's about it.
That's fine.
But thank you. It was really inspiring, and I'm really excited to meet all of you. Thank you for sharing.
Rachel, do you want to? Or let's go to Julian. Actually, can you?
Sorry, I failed.
There we go. Look, my computer's working. Wow. Again, just want to reiterate the amazing energy and skills and knowledge that we've got here. And so it's marvelous to see everyone coming together. Some of my takeaways is there's obviously a lot of duplication and effort. And, you know, I think we'd be more powerful working together. So I'm really excited to see this. Slack would be great for me. If we are going to sort of think of a way to communicate and collaborate moving forward. And some of the stuff that Mark said is really interesting in terms of Esri costing a lot. You know, what does it cost for communities and open access to data? And there's a move for platform drops, which means that the digital infrastructure that actually delivers the services are also owned by the community. So I think that's really important to consider moving forward. And there's open access to government data. They've opened up the Ordnance Survey data. I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, the Chancellor announced 80 million in the budget to open up Ordnance Survey and Land Registry data, which is a very slow process. But 2 years later, there's a certain amount of Ordnance Survey data you can use for free via their APIs and what have you. And then the access to data, you know, with local authorities again is really key. They do have a lot of data, and it's a case of getting access to it and making sure it's in an accessible format. So I look forward to sort of continuing those conversations. But yeah, just generally really excited. So I'll pass on to Maddie.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really amazing to hear you having this conversation and kind of hearing about things that I really don't understand. You're nodding away like that, a little bit technical stuff. I'm really glad that you understand each other. I did understand most of it. But yes, yeah, what I'm hearing in my work with the Urban Agriculture Consortium is the level of need of this work, this kind of work. I've just come out of the Fringe Farming project launch for Sheffield. They're talking about mapping, the need to map food growing opportunities in the peri-urban and suburban spaces. You know, the need is huge. And so they'll be looking to projects like these to know what is the best practice and how do we do it in a way where the power shifts in the process of doing this mapping, just like you were saying, Julian, so that and what I love about what I'm hearing is how completely unsiloed it is, that actually underpinning it all is this sense of how human beings connect with place and are empowered by a relationship to land, and how the maps are an integral part of that process of reconnecting to place, which is so sort of fundamental to us, especially in urban places. So I love that about it. Yeah, really, really excited to have brought you all together, and yeah, we'll really just help to hold this process for however you will feel it needs to go, basically, and bring other people in as as needed. I think Hugh from the Town and Country Planning Association would be a really interesting person to have in the conversation as well, and how it connects with planning and so on. Thank you so much, Gary. Well done with all your amazing work. I'll speak to you soon. So yeah, a month is fine. Slack is fine. yeah, just hear what other people have to say about those elements. Jess.
Thanks, Maddie. I'm leaving really positive, optimistic. Just great to hear about all your work. I just think it's fabulous, and yeah, it'd be great to continue the conversation. I guess I can see there's a need for like detailed technical conversations. I love my nerd in a nerd would love to be there. I probably don't need to be there, and that I'm happy to take part in the big picture stuff, and I'm really interested in that rights stuff you're doing, Incredible Edible as well. It just sounds really great. So really excited about what we can do together. Month sounds good, and I'm rubbish at keeping up with Slack, but don't let that stop you. I'll pass to Alison, maybe.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got 1:30 as well. I'm completely new to all this, but again, Inner Geek is loving it. But I'm kind of conscious that we have quite a lot of data in very basic formats, but we know it's kind of relevant and keep them being updated. So what I'm really keen on is how that can be inputted into systems that are already there, but also for then us, as Julian was saying, about us being able then to manipulate that and get that out at the other end without those technical skills and those access and that kind of 100% involvement in mapping. So I feel that we're kind of probably coming at it, although we're a national big organization, actually we're coming at it at a very community level and making sure that everything there can be useful for very low level stuff. And then my other takeaway is a slight side one, but Janie, really interested in the right to grow bits and pieces, and the community land advisory service that we run at Social Farms and Gardens is just running in Wales at the moment. I feel that would be really useful, and I think that's kind of a next step from some of this mapping. So there's like the kind of technical mapping bits and pieces, but then how do we make sure that that can actually make into something, can cause action. So I'm sure Lucy Taylor, who actually Gary manages, will be really interested in talking about that. And we've got some old resources from England and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, but how the resources and the toolkits for then supporting those small community groups can be using that mapping to tackle the ownership issues and the access issues would be really useful as well.
Okay, everyone has to go. I'd just like, I think the rights to grow thing is really something that I want to feed into. Rights to soil information, rights to data, rights to land registry, all of this stuff could come together in this one piece, because I think that's a barrier for progress for many of us around this table today. So Hugh Ellis, who Maddie mentioned, he's the guy writing this rights to grow bill, and I will definitely share this recording with him. And I think there's two sets of conversations that can follow. Everybody's going. So there's the data, and then there's this other stuff. So let's all meet in a month and we'll sort it. Bye, everybody. Bye. Good to see you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That was great.
Bye.
Well done with all your projects.
Thank you. Bye. Nice to meet you.
Bye, John.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Maddie, I was just going to...
Yeah.
Oh, and Jamie. Sorry,
I was going to ask Maddie something, but you go first. Rachel.
Go. I was just going to also mention that Sustain have been in contact about the project as well. I think through the fringe farming stuff, Sustain and shared assets. And I've been speaking to someone called Rob Logan, who I sent him some details about the hotspots mapping, or the urban hotspots mapping, but he wants to arrange a meeting in September around that with those partners. But it sounds like it would be sensible for also Janie and your team to be there too, because we've already done like the urban part quite fully. So
yeah, I mean, Sustain, well, Capital Growth is our version in London, who I talk with a lot, Sarah Williams, but yeah, we definitely should have Sustain on board with this conversation. So that's a really good, it's good that they're connecting with you already.
Yeah,
so much today, wasn't there? It's like, I can't get my head around
thank you for connecting us. That was really valuable.
Oh, it's so good, Rachel, and I really like that what you're doing is there's so much overlap, but so much knowledge from Mark, obviously, from all the GeoFutures work. So
yeah, I think that's really valuable to have that resource of what because I don't know anything about GIS or data actually. I'm just coming from the food perspective really, and bringing that kind of what are our needs.
Yeah, and I just think the time is right. This is absolutely, we're right there. We've got all this background knowledge and history behind, you know, collectively the people here today was just absolutely phenomenal how much we all know. And that is absolutely why we've got to see how we can work together now. You can see those sort of fundamental things really coming to fore already, like using QGIS and not using this, and you know that what is the common platform that will enable all these things to happen in the right way. And you know, very cool. I think there's probably I think we should allow the data people to have their conversation separately as well as with us all, because I think there's an awful lot of sharing that needs to go on there about you know, what Mark has learnt really over the years. But yeah, it's access to this info. I just think it's really interesting. It's like, I'll just let you in on something, Rachel, that Maddie and I, because there's something we didn't touch on at all today, is that Maddie and I started working together because we want to see how the Church of England can map its land, right? And we discovered at a meeting, this guy from the church, quite a senior guy, that the land was mapped for this, it's called Coming Home. It was a big piece of work they did on social housing. On how the Church of England can provide land for social housing. So they commissioned Knight Frank to do the mapping of all of the Church of England land for this particular piece of research, the Coming Home piece. And then Knight Frank won't release that information to each diocese unless they pay £25,000.
Wow. Wow.
And Maddie and I heard him say this, and then what was quite funny was the guy dropped out of the conversation, and both of us, our jaws just dropped, didn't they?
Yeah, I thought you were going to say £25.
£25,000 for each diocese. It's a complete disgrace.
Yeah,
I think it's that they can sort of see what was done as it is, but they can't use it. They can't kind of use it to then implement their plans or strategies. They have to pay 25 grand to pay this other partner company whose name I can't remember.
Knight Frank.
But there was somebody else as well.
Oh, was there someone else in the middle?
Yeah, who was another sort of like the community engagement consultant bit of it. I can't remember their name. I hadn't seen their name before.
Against, isn't it? That kind of siloing thing.
And money like not being open basically with what you're trying to do and what you've created.
Yeah.
But anyway,
it's so limiting, and how frustrating for the diocese that want to do stuff, and oh great, the church is, the synod or whoever makes these sort of
big decisions.
Maybe not. Big financial decisions. How much must it cost them to get that piece of work done? And why did they sign up to an agreement where it was going to cost another 25 grand? And they're sort of operating at in a hierarchy, in such a hierarchy that they don't know what the more community-led alternatives are. So they go with Knight Frank because they don't know that there might be other ways of going about it which are more community-led and accessible. So
this is why it's so good to meet up like this and to speak openly. And I think it's a wonderfully freeing thing when you stop worrying about profit, isn't it? And money. But as soon as you don't, or even impact, like in academic circles, it's about having the idea and it's your idea and you're going to get your name on the paper. And it's as soon as you don't care about that, it opens so many more doors.
No, it was a very nice, free, open conversation, wasn't it?
Yeah, and when you start, your whole thing is about gearing towards collaborative advantage. So by doing things together and more in a joined up way, you unlock all these other dimensions of things that weren't available to you before, and on a scale that wasn't possible before. So that sort of collaborative advantage thing. That's very good. So you're saying about Rob,
So
what's really interesting about Rob as well is that he's working with the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience with Chiara, and in the Urbanising in Place project, which is just like blows my mind, all about resourcing agroecological urbanism, as they call it. And there's the urban-rural divide and everything. And Rob is working closely with Chiara.
I'm going to go, but
yeah,
I think you can both talk. If I just leave the meeting,